I don't know where I got the idea. All right, I really don't. But I grew up with the idea that somehow it was wrong to think about the birth of Christ at Christmas. Did any of you grow up with that? I see a lot of, so it was a common thing. I don't know if it's just a Church of Christ thing or maybe it is. Because I know a lot of Baptist churches have Christmas trees on the stage, so it must be a Church of Christ thing. But my boss over at the university, Monty Cox, said one time at a Christmas party we were having for the College of Bible and Ministry, he said how ridiculous it is for us to spend 364 days in a year trying to get people to think about Jesus, and then the one day they go, no, this is not right, we shouldn't do this. And so I just decided to be comfortable with it and realize that a lot of people are thinking about it at this time of year too. But what are they thinking about is my question. What are they thinking about? So as I was doing my Christmas shopping this week, I would see the latest National Geographic or Time, and they have Jesus on the cover. And the question is always about, who is Jesus? Or where does he come from? Or how can we know? There's this popular sentiment out there today that we don't even know if Jesus ever even really existed. He's so far removed from us. Is that the case? And then there's the question of faith. Do you have to have proof in order to accept this whole thing? Well, of course you don't. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So faith means you have evidence even when you can't see it or hear it or touch it. But to dismiss the historical study of the life of Jesus just because you have faith, I think is wrong-headed. And to dismiss the historical reality of Jesus just because you didn't see it, I think is wrong-headed as well. Is there somewhere in the middle where we can, by faith, present the historical reality? And that's what I'd like you to think about with me for a few minutes this morning. There's a passage in Galatians 4 where Paul says in verse 4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Our faith is grounded in a historical event that happened at a particular time. And Paul says it's something that happened at the perfect time. Our faith is grounded in a historical event that happened in a real time, in a real place, amongst real people. There's an Australian scholar named John Dickson, and I use a couple of his books in my survey classes. Two of them in particular. One's called The Christ Files, and the other is called Life of Jesus, Who He Is and Why He Matters. And Dickson teaches in a university in Australia. Australia is believed to be the first truly post-Christian society. The vast majority of people in Australia would consider themselves to be non-religious or atheist or something like that. And so Dickson finds himself in a very unique place as a religion professor in that environment. So he's written a lot of books that talk about historical evidences for Christianity and especially for the life of Jesus. And in his book, Life of Jesus, Who He Is and Why He Matters, that little book comes with a little 6-video class series where you not only get to listen to Dickson talk about these things, but then you get to see some of the sites and things like that. For just a few minutes, I want you to watch just a few minutes of his first video, because he's going to bring up something that I think is really significant And then we're going to use that as a launching point to talk about what Paul meant when he said, when the time had fully come. What did he mean by that? Okay? So let's watch a few minutes of this. I'm not going to watch the whole thing, but I know you like hearing people talk other than me, and especially if they've got an accent, right? That's not hillbilly. So this is John Dickson, Life of Jesus, who he is, and why he matters.
The world is a very religious place. While some of us are atheists, around 5% according to surveys, most believe that behind the stunning order of the universe stands some great mind, what many call God. It's an important question, one people feel very strongly about. After all, if there is a mind behind it all, our lives, we're told, are intended, part of a larger purpose. If there isn't, we are dust on the floor of eternity.
Belief in a creator is very common. Just about every culture we know anything significant about has considered this an important idea. But is there any indication on the world stage that the God of our hunches has touched the earth in some observable way?
In part, this is an historical question, and it's as an historian that I want to explore the daring claim of the world's 2 billion Christians. Uniquely among the great faiths, Christianity goes out on a limb by suggesting that God offered a tangible sign of his reality right here in the fertile hills, valleys and waterways of first century Galilee.
Most religions claim some kind of revelation. Buddhism, for instance, rests on the profound insights of Siddhartha Gautama, the Indian prince who experienced a moment of enlightenment while meditating under a Bodhi tree.
Hinduism looks to the Vedas, passed on to the first man at the dawn of time. And Islam says the angel Gabriel dictated to the Prophet Muhammad the very words of God. Christianity claims something very different.
At the heart of the world's largest faith is not just a profound insight or a mystical drama or even a dictation of divine words in a holy book, but a series of events which are said to have taken place in public, in datable time, and recorded by a variety of witnesses.
Greg, great to have you along on this Life of Jesus journey.
Great to be part of it.
I guess the first question that the Jesus story raises is about the existence of God. It seems that people throughout history, throughout the world, have believed in some kind of grand mind. Is that right?
Well, that's got to be our starting point, hasn't it? I mean, it's true that most people in most cultures, at most times in history, have believed in some kind of divine being or beings, some kind of great mind or deity that's behind it all. It's always going to be really difficult to disprove God, to prove that God doesn't exist. I mean, you can't really prove a negative. So we're left asking questions like, well, is it possible for God to exist, or is it likely that God exists?
I think a lot of people would accept that it's possible. Even hardcore skeptics would say it's possible, but they'd question you that it's likely.
You're right, most people do think it's possible. Some people think that the fact that there's evil and suffering in the world is enough to show that God could not exist. God couldn't allow a world like this to exist. But most people, even on that question, are saying that they're crying out to God. It makes them hungrier for God. It's not a disapproval of God's existence, it makes you want to understand God better. So we're left really asking that question, well, is it likely that God exists? And I think it's likely that God exists for a whole bunch of reasons. Let me just give you a few of them. First one is that God really is the best explanation of why there's something here rather than nothing. I mean, proposing that there's an eternal being that is the reason for the universe actually makes a lot more sense than suggesting it just spontaneously somehow occurred. I mean, that is just less rational. Secondly, I think that the kind of universe we see in its extraordinarily complex arrangements, its wonder, its beauty, you just don't get those kind of universes by chance. I mean, even there hasn't really been enough time, even by processes like gradual evolution, for such a universe to have come about by chance. A universe that's filled with intelligence, with people like you and like me who can understand the universe. We just have an excess of intelligence, and it is really hard to explain that unless you propose that there's some mind behind it, rather than just mindless chance. Thirdly, I think when you look at the universe, it's just the kind of place you'd expect to find if God is real. And it's the kind of place you wouldn't expect to find if there's no God. I mean, things like human conscience. We have a sense of right and wrong, a sense that what we do matters. These things make more sense if there's someone behind the universe to whom we are accountable. Things like our sense of meaning and purpose. I mean, all human beings, most human beings at least, think the world is meaningful rather than meaningless, and this draws us back towards someone, some mind who is generating the meaning. So other things like the fact that we have a fear of death and a sense of eternity, these are all things that point us back towards God, and I find when you add these all together, there's a great likelihood that God is real.
For better or worse, Christian scripture is different from other holy books. In the events of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, believers claim to see a tangible sign directing us to the kingdom of God.
Christians are therefore claiming to possess not just a dogma, a set of divine truths, but a verifiable history. As a result, the beliefs and texts of Christianity are suddenly open to public investigation.
It's as if Christianity places its neck on the chopping block of academic scrutiny and invites anyone who wishes to come and take a swing. Which is why historians in universities all over the world feel at liberty to look at the Christian's holy book called the New Testament as a simple historical text.
So what happens when the theologians hand the New Testament over to the historians? What do we find out about what really took place here in Palestine during the reigns of Augustus and Tiberius? In short, what can the historian confidently say about the life of Yeshua ben Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph?
Christianity claims to be built on real events in real history. These are the remains of Magdala, the Galilean hometown of Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' prominent supporters. It's just one of the many places mentioned in the New Testament historians have access to.
People could be forgiven today for thinking that most of the details of Jesus' life are either unknown or completely contrary to what Christians have been saying all these years. As we'll see, neither position is true. So what kind of evidence should we expect to find for a figure like Jesus? Well, the first thing to hold in mind is the sheer randomness of history. You know, only a tiny proportion of the writings and buildings of the first century has survived, perhaps even less than 1%.
We have shopping dockets from lowly peasants of the first century, and yet not one piece of correspondence from Emperor Tiberius, the man who ruled the world in Jesus' day. Scholars have to draw their conclusions from the flotsam and jetsam that history throws up.
And here's a great example. The Gospel of John mentions a public bathing pool in the Siloam district of Jerusalem. Jesus is meant to have healed someone there. But archaeological digs throughout the city had failed to discover such a pool, and some scholars doubted it ever existed. But then in June 2004, during some sewerage works here in the old part of Jerusalem, workers accidentally uncovered these steps, which led down to this amazing Jewish pool, definitively dated to the time of Jesus. To the embarrassment of some, it is without doubt the missing pool of Siloam.
The careful historian tries not to guess about the sort of evidence we should have for a relatively minor figure like Jesus. Instead, they sift through the evidence that has survived and see what comes up.
So what has come up? Actually, more than you might think.
The Stoic writer Mara Bar Serapion refers to Jesus as a king, teacher, and martyr. Writing sometime shortly after the year AD 73, Mara says of Jesus, "What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? And it was just after that their kingdom was abolished. But Socrates did not die altogether. He lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die altogether. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die altogether. He lived on in the teaching which he had given." The Roman historian Tacitus confirms Jesus' execution by order of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He writes, "Christians derived their name from a man called Christ, who, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, had been executed by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstition thus checked for the moment broke out afresh, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular." A Jewish writer delivers a similar highlights package. Josephus commanded troops in Galilee 3 decades after Jesus. Towards the end of the 1st century, he wrote up a history of his Jewish people, in which he makes passing mention of the Galilean teacher Jesus. Josephus describes him as a renowned wonder worker and martyr, and he tells us that some called him Christ or Messiah. At this time, there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following, both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was perhaps the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not died out. It's
A couple of things that I want to point out to you. First of all, how many times does he say that Christianity is really unique among world religions? He said that about 3 times at the very beginning of the video. Do you remember what reason he gave for that? What reason did he give for Christianity really being unique when compared to Buddhism or Islam or Hinduism? Number of witnesses. He pointed us to the historical nature of the events. These weren't private revelations, right? And the line he uses is that Christianity sticks its neck out on the chopping block and says, "Hit me with your best shot." And I think that comes from this idea in the Gospel of Luke. Look at Luke. Look at the beginning of Luke. I want to show you a couple of texts here in Luke. One at the beginning of chapter 1, then one at the beginning of chapter 2. All right, now before we read Luke, I want to point you to the last thing. This last little video part of the video that we saw, he quotes three folks: Mara Bar Serapion, Tacitus, and Josephus. Did you get why he was quoting them? Historical record. Those 3 folks aren't believers. Okay, so one of the problems you have when studying the Scripture is you say, is there any evidence for the life of Jesus? And you say, well, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, you've got historical scholars who are going to say, can't trust those. Those are biased accounts. You know, they watch CNN, but they call the Gospels biased accounts, but we won't get into that. So it becomes really important then when you find outside sources, folks who aren't biased, like Tacitus, a pagan Roman historian. You might even remember in Tacitus' account, he calls Christianity an evil superstition that started in Judea and then has come to Rome, where every evil comes to thrive, you know, kind of like New York City. Anyway, when you start having those outside pieces of evidence pointing back to the story, all of a sudden that carries some weight with the scholars. And so anybody who tells you, we don't even have any evidence that Jesus ever lived, they're the ones who are ignorant, not you. There is a lot of evidence from sources outside that this man Jesus actually lived. But now to the question of this gospel bias. Look at the first paragraph in the Gospel of Luke. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Okay, just from that first line, I am informed that there were a lot of people who were writing down things about Jesus. And Luke knows about them. Do you get that? He says there's a lot of people been writing down their story about all these things that we've seen. You know, the stories about Jesus originally circulated by word of mouth. People saw what he did, they heard what he said, and they began telling those stories. The Gospels weren't written down until many years after the fact. Maybe as many as 30 years after the fact, only when the eyewitnesses started dying out and the people who followed Jesus most closely said, you know, we ought to write these things down before they become forgotten. And so Luke says, I am aware that there are a lot of people who have written down things about Jesus. Verse 2, just as those who from the beginning were eye ministers and witnesses of the word have delivered them to us. So not only were there people writing things down, but they were writing down the things that were being passed on orally from eyewitnesses. All right, so Luke talks about the eyewitness testimony that led to the things being written down. And so then verse 3, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. Okay, Luke is kind of widely perceived to be a historian of the highest caliber, especially when you get into the book of Acts. You know, the book of Acts contains a lot of travel narratives, contains a lot of information about local authorities in particular places and how government works and how travel works and things like that. Even the title of that work, Acts, that is not a random title, okay? There was an entire category of literature in Luke's day called praxes or acts. In other words, if you went to Barnes & Noble in Rome in the first century and you walked up to the person at the desk and you said, show me where the acts are, they would say, oh, the acts section is over there. All right? There were a lot of folks who were writing down the stories of great heroes or warriors or whatever, and they called them acts, and Luke says, I'm writing something very similar to that about this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And when I publish it, you can put it on the shelf over there in the Acts section with all the other historical, biographical works about Julius Caesar or Alexander or whomever. All right, so Luke not only conceives himself to be a historian of the highest caliber, playing ball with the big boys, his work has also been shown, has been proved to be exceedingly accurate, even when the scholars weren't exactly sure what he was talking about. Let me give you an example. There are some places in Acts where where Luke talks about Paul coming into a city and being greeted by some of the local magistrates, and Luke has a very particular word that he uses to describe them. Well, for a long time, people said, well, see there, Luke doesn't know what he's talking about. Those magistrates were never called that word. Well, come to find out, they actually were, and Luke had it right all along, and the scholars were wrong, and now they've had to change their position based on something that they've learned first in Luke, and then have now discovered in other sources. All right, so those are just two little bits of information. So Luke believes himself to be a historian of the highest caliber, playing ball with the big boys. He has read the other accounts. He has investigated the story of Jesus for himself. Because remember, Luke is not a Jew, right? He's a Gentile. He has become converted to Christianity. We don't know how or where, but we do know that he has a friend named Theophilus. Now, I don't know what his relationship to Theophilus is. It could be that Luke is the physician who works for the Theophilus family. Okay? It could be that they're just good friends. I don't know. The little phrase, most excellent Theophilus, those aren't just throwaway words. That is actually a technical title that indicates Theophilus is probably an official of some influence. And Luke says, I have followed all this. I've talked to the eyewitnesses. I've read the other accounts. And now, Theophilus, I want to let you know what I've learned because I want you to have certainty about the things that you have been taught. What a statement. I want you to know with certainty. I don't want there to be any question in your mind. I want you to know, Theophilus, that you don't have to check your brains at the door to accept this story about Jesus that you have heard. Joe?
I just wanted to ask your opinion about the word Theophilus, meaning God lover. Could this not have been Luke's way of writing to most excellent God lover?
It could be. Well, all right, so what Joe brings up is here, this name Theophilus is a Greek name that means lover of God, okay? And so there are some folks who say this is a literary device that Luke is using to actually address all people who love God. So the question is Theophilus a real individual, or is this a literary device that Luke is using to address all those who love God, to convince all those who have accepted this message of the certainty of the story? And I tend to believe it's a real dude. But because of just, most excellent, the way he gives this title of deference and honor, I don't know that it makes a lot of difference either way. All right, because whether it's written to a single person or a crowd of people, it was meant to be read widely, right? So it's an interesting academic question, but I don't know if I can answer it one way or the other, or even if it matters, because it's not going to change the interpretation of the story at all. The bottom line is, Luke wants these people to know with certainty. Luke does not say, well, you have faith and that's enough. He says, no, I want you to understand that your faith is not just